On a frozen night in 1910, a wealthy rancher saved a dying nurse. But he didn't know that single moment would destroy his empire and expose a letter no one was ever meant to read. The wind screamed through the abandoned station like a warning from the past. Snow swallowed the tracks. The lantern flickered, barely alive. She stood there, 25 years old, shaking, starving, fading. This station wasn't her destination. It was her last chance. Then hooves broke the silence. A man emerged from the storm, tall, wealthy, untouchable, a rancher whose land stretched farther than most people's lives. He didn't ask her name, didn't ask where she came from. He took off his coat and wrapped his empire around her shoulders. In that moment, two worlds collided, power and survival, wealth and desperation. Before leaving, he said one thing: "It's a long way to anywhere from here." And then he disappeared into the snow. She never forgot him, and years later, he would discover a letter that would shatter everything he believed about himself. The wind howled like forgotten whispers through the darkened expanse of the station. The air was thick with cold, an unforgiving chill that cut through the bones. The year was 1910, and the small train station stood like an ancient relic, abandoned, decaying as though time had forsaken it. The wood of the station's platform groaned beneath the weight of history, and the faint glow of a single lantern flickered weakly in the mist, its light struggling against the thick blanket of falling snow. The scene, muted in color and sound, was almost otherworldly, a place forgotten by the world, a world forgotten by time. Only the quiet creak of the station's broken doors and the steady fall of snow on the tracks broke the eerie silence. A young woman stood at the edge of the platform, her frail form barely visible against the swirling snow. She couldn't have been more than 25, though her appearance betrayed a weariness beyond her years. Her coat, once a deep gray, had been reduced to little more than a tattered rag. The fabric clung to her thin frame like a memory of a life once lived with more care, more comfort. Her breath came in shallow, visible puffs, mingling with the steam of the cold night. She had been walking for hours, her body stiff with the biting cold, her fingers numb from the frost. The station, this lonely, forgotten place, was her only hope now. She had come here seeking warmth, seeking some kind of refuge from the harshness of the world. Her feet slipped on the icy platform as she staggered, her knees buckling beneath her. For a moment, the world seemed to spin, the cold taking her to the edge of consciousness. Her vision blurred, the distant hum of the wind filling her ears as she tried to steady herself. She fought to stay on her feet, to hold on to the fleeting hope that something would change, something would offer her warmth. But the snow continued to fall, heavy and unrelenting, as though the earth itself was conspiring against her. Then, through the haze of her failing strength, she heard it, the sound of hooves, muffled but steady, drawing closer through the snow-covered road. The rhythmic pounding of the horses' hooves broke the silence, an unexpected arrival in this desolate place. The woman's heart skipped a beat, a flicker of relief mingling with the confusion of her mind. She squinted through the snow, trying to focus on the figure approaching. A man, tall and rugged, was riding a horse toward her. His coat was brown and weathered, and his boots looked as though they had walked miles of hard, unforgiving earth. His face, framed by the faint light of the lantern, was weathered and hardened by years of toil. There was a quiet strength in his posture, the way he sat atop the horse, seemingly at ease amidst the storm. As he neared, his eyes caught hers. The woman could barely make out his features through the blur of the snow, but the connection between them, however brief, was undeniable. His gaze softened, an unspoken understanding passing between them. It was the kind of look that said more than words ever could. She was frozen, caught in the moment, unsure whether to speak, unsure whether she was still capable of speech. But as he dismounted, the chill in the air seemed to press deeper into her bones, and she found herself trembling even more violently. The man moved quickly, his boots crunching on the snow as he approached her. His hands, rough and calloused from years of work, were gentle as they reached for her. He did not say a word, but there was something in the way he looked at her, an unspoken offer of help. Without hesitation, he draped his brown coat over her shoulders, his warmth spilling into her frail body. She could feel the heat of his body, the solidness of his presence seeping into her, offering her some kind of comfort, some kind of shelter from the cold. For a moment they stood there in the storm, two strangers, bound by nothing more than a shared moment of isolation. The man's brow furrowed as he looked down at her, his concern apparent in his eyes. He didn't ask her name, didn't question her about where she had come from or why she was here. He only stood there, holding her in his coat, offering her what little warmth he could spare. The silence between them was thick, heavy, almost suffocating. There were no words, only the sound of the snow falling softly around them, the faint crackle of the lantern flickering in the distance. It was as if the world itself had paused for this moment, a stillness that stretched between them, filled with questions that neither was willing to voice. The woman's hands, now hidden beneath the warmth of his coat, trembled, but it wasn't from the cold. It was something deeper, a fear, a hesitation, a knowledge that this moment, brief as it was, would change something inside her. Her mind, clouded by the fog of exhaustion, struggled to make sense of it. Why had he stopped? Why had he helped her? There was something in his eyes, something that suggested he had seen more of the world's hardships than he cared to acknowledge. Perhaps he was simply being kind, or perhaps there was more to it than that. She did not know him, and yet she felt an undeniable pull, an unspoken connection that tugged at her heart. She had walked into this station seeking warmth, seeking refuge, but now she found herself caught in the weight of his gaze, unsure whether the warmth he offered was real, or if it was something fleeting, something that would disappear as quickly as it had arrived. As he stepped back, allowing her to breathe, the wind seemed to pick up, swirling the snow around them in angry gusts. The lantern flickered once more, casting long shadows across the platform. The man turned his gaze toward the distant train tracks, his expression hardening. For a moment the woman wondered if he was about to leave, to vanish into the storm, leaving her alone once again. But before she could voice the question that had begun to form in her mind, he spoke. "It's a long way to anywhere from here," he said, his voice deep and calm, yet carrying a weight that seemed to echo in the stillness. She nodded, unsure of what to say, unsure of what to ask. The train station, silent and cold, stood like a tomb behind them. The old structure, forgotten by time, seemed to hold secrets within its walls, stories untold, lives lost to the passage of years. And here in the silence between them, a history, both personal and shared, seemed to hang in the air, waiting to be revealed. But before she could respond, the man mounted his horse once more, his coat still draped around her shoulders. The horse pawed at the snow beneath it, eager to leave. With one last glance, he turned his horse toward the road, the sounds of hooves fading into the distance. The woman stood alone once again, her mind reeling with questions. Who was he? Why had he stopped for her? And more importantly, what was it that lingered between them, something unspoken, something that neither of them had dared to address? As the man disappeared into the storm, the lantern flickered one last time, its light dimming into the darkness. The cold returned, more insistent now, pressing against her skin, but it was not just the weather that chilled her. It was the silence that had followed his departure, the weight of unasked questions hanging in the air. The woman stood there alone as the storm raged around her. The train, distant and unnoticed, had become nothing more than a shadow in the storm. But in that fleeting moment, in the cold, in the silence, something had changed. A question had been raised, a history had been touched, and the echoes of that brief encounter would follow them both, even long after the train had left and the storm had passed. Would she ever find the warmth she sought, or would it remain as elusive as the man who had disappeared into the snow? The snow continued to fall around them, a quiet, oppressive blanket that seemed to soften the world into nothingness. In the shadow of the crumbling train station, they sat side by side, their bodies pressed together by the warmth of his coat, but the distance between them felt far wider than the snow that separated them from the rest of the world. The flickering lantern cast long, distorted shadows over their faces, making their features appear unfamiliar, as if time itself had forgotten them. The woman, her hands still trembling beneath the brown coat, glanced up at him briefly but quickly looked away. She had no words, only the silence of her exhaustion, the heaviness of her weariness. Her body ached with the strain of a life spent in service, her mind clouded with the constant fight to simply survive. He, the millionaire rancher, seemed so different, yet in this moment they were both bound by something invisible. He had offered her warmth, yet it wasn't just his coat that sheltered her. It was his presence, his proximity, something she had not expected in the solitude of the station. His hands, rough from years of labor, had offered her what little he could give, but even as he sat beside her, there was something in his eyes that betrayed a world of contradictions. His wealth had built him an empire, stretching across miles of land, but it was a barren empire, one of cold stone and empty promises. A wealth of silence, of suffering hidden behind the closed doors of his grand estates. His fortune had been made at the expense of the very people who worked for him, the workers who had become little more than ghosts in his sprawling domain. As the wind howled outside, the silence between them deepened, and yet, despite the cold and the isolation, she found it hard to look at him. He seemed too distant, too powerful in a way that made her feel small and insignificant. She had heard whispers about men like him, about the ways they controlled their workers, not with chains and whips, but with something far more insidious. The control of their lives, their very existence, was woven into the fabric of his wealth. In the kitchens of the grand houses, behind closed doors in darkened corners, there were rumors, whispers of how he kept his workers bound to him, not with force, but with promises of survival, promises that could never be fulfilled. He had turned his wealth into a system of silent oppression, a suffocating grip that no one could escape from. And yet, in this fleeting moment, as he held her close, the injustices of their lives seemed to vanish into the cold night air. The stark reality of their worlds, their positions in this vast, cruel system, seemed far away, almost irrelevant in the warmth of his coat. It was a brief respite, a fragile bubble where the weight of their lives could not reach them. The woman's shivering had stopped, replaced by a deep exhaustion, as though her body had finally allowed itself to rest, to accept the warmth she so desperately needed. She felt the comfort of his coat around her shoulders, but it wasn't just the fabric that offered solace. There was something else, something deeper in the gesture, a moment of compassion in a world that had long since abandoned her. For the rancher, the warmth of her presence was something he had never truly expected. His life had been one of cold calculation, of distance from the people he ruled. His wealth had built him walls of stone, keeping him separated from the lives of those who served him. But now, as she sat beside him, her breath warm against his chest, he felt a stirring inside him, something he had long buried beneath his wealth and power. In that brief moment, he was reminded of a world outside of his empire, a world where compassion and kindness still existed. It was a fleeting thought, one that he quickly pushed away, replaced by the realization that this moment, too, would pass. He could offer her warmth, but he could not offer her freedom, not from the world they lived in, not from the invisible chains that bound them both. The silence between them stretched on, heavy with unspoken words. She didn't ask him about his life, and he didn't ask her about hers. There was no need. In the stillness, they both understood that words would do nothing to bridge the gap between them. They were both trapped in their own prisons, she in the struggle for survival, he in the empire he had built upon the backs of others. There was no easy answer, no way to escape the harsh realities of their lives. His wealth, for all its grandeur, was a mask, a thin veneer of success that hid the darkness of the world he had created. Her life, too, had become a mask, one she had worn for so long that she no longer recognized the woman beneath it. She was a nurse, a healer, but the very work that had once given her purpose had become a prison, a trap from which there was no escape. The world outside the station was silent, the snow falling gently in the night, but inside a storm raged. The truth of their lives, the weight of the world they lived in, pressed down upon them both. And yet in this brief moment of warmth, they were able to pretend, just for a moment, that the world outside didn't matter. But the truth was that they could not escape it, not as long as they lived in the system they had been born into. As the train began to approach, its whistle cutting through the silence like a scream, the moment seemed to dissolve. The rancher stood up, the warmth of his coat no longer enough to shield him from the reality that awaited them both. She too stood, her body once again trembling from the cold, though now it was not just the chill of the wind. The warmth of the moment had passed, and they were left standing at the edge of the platform, each holding on to a piece of something that could never be. He offered her a final glance, his eyes filled with a mixture of pity and something deeper, something that neither of them dared to acknowledge. She met his gaze, her eyes filled with the same sorrow, the same understanding that had passed between them in the silence. As the train pulled into the station, the final barrier between them, the truth of their lives returned. They were in the end bound to the same world, the same system of injustice that would keep them apart. But for this brief moment, they had shared something, however fleeting, that none of the wealth or power in the world could ever buy. The woman stepped away, her feet crunching on the snow as she turned to board the train. She didn't look back. Neither did he. The train, heavy and lumbering, swallowed up the space between them, carrying them both away from this fleeting moment of warmth and understanding. The station, silent once more, stood as it had before, a forgotten relic of a world that had long since moved on. And in the quiet that followed, the truth remained, hidden beneath the layers of power, wealth, and silence that they had both tried to escape. Some truths can never be outrun. Some lives, no matter how much we try, are bound by the weight of history. The days grew colder as the months passed. The world outside seemed to move on, indifferent to the lives of two souls whose paths had crossed for a brief, fleeting moment. The woman whose name had been lost to the shadows of the past returned to the hospital, a place where the walls echoed with the sounds of footsteps, the scent of antiseptic, and the silent weight of duty. She carried with her the memory of the rancher, the warmth of his coat, and the fleeting kindness in his eyes. But it wasn't just the warmth she remembered. It was his touch, gentle, almost unnoticeable, but it left something behind, a mark on her heart that she could not erase. She returned to her work, to the sterile routine of her days, but the memory of him lingered in the corners of her mind. She couldn't explain it, not even to herself. It was as though a door had been opened, and though she had no intention of walking through it, she couldn't close it either. Meanwhile, he, the wealthy rancher, returned to his sprawling estate. The grand house stood as it always had, proud and imposing against the backdrop of the barren land. It was a fortress built from the sweat and blood of others, a monument to his success, his power. He didn't know why he couldn't shake the memory of her either. His life had returned to its rhythm, the long days spent overseeing his land, the endless letters to read, the endless meetings with men who served him. There were no breaks in the walls he had built around himself. Yet there was something about her that refused to leave his thoughts. It wasn't love, not yet at least. It was something more troubling, more complex. He had no use for emotions, no need for affection or attachment. But the thought of her, the image of her face, pale and trembling in the cold, haunted him in the quiet of his office in the moments when he was alone with his thoughts. The seasons shifted, and with them, the silence between them deepened. But then, in the fragile silence of winter, the unexpected happened. The woman fell gravely ill. No one knew what had caused it, but it had been quick and merciless. The doctors were baffled, the symptoms worsening each day. Her frail body, already worn by years of hard work, could not fight it off. The once vibrant nurse had become a shadow of herself, her body fighting against a sickness that seemed to drain her of life with each passing hour. It was in this moment, in the darkness of her suffering, that something changed for the rancher. He had never truly cared for anyone, not in the way that she seemed to matter, in the way that people had always mattered to him only as parts of his empire. But in the quiet of his office, after reading yet another report from his workers, he had been overtaken by an impulse he could not name. He couldn't explain it. He simply had to go. He had to see her, to find her, to make sure she was all right. It wasn't love, not yet at least, but it was something else, something he could not ignore. His privilege, his wealth, his empire, none of it seemed to matter when the thought of her consumed him. For the first time in his life, he was powerless, but it was a powerlessness born not of circumstance, but of emotion. He had become a man who had lived his life on the strength of his control, but now, in the face of her illness, that control was slipping away. When he arrived at the hospital, it was a small, quiet room that greeted him. He stood there, unsure of his next move, the heavy weight of his decisions pressing against him. The room was dimly lit, the flickering candle casting shadows on the walls. The woman lay on the bed, pale and fragile, her chest rising and falling with shallow breaths. The sight of her, so still, so vulnerable, was a stark contrast to the vibrant, lively woman he had once seen standing in the cold with him. For the first time, he saw her not as a nurse, not as someone beneath him, but as a person. A person who had been through more than he could ever understand. But it was not just the sight of her that disturbed him. It was the letter, the small piece of paper tucked beneath the pillow that caught his eye. It had been meant for him, a letter written in her delicate hand, yet never sent. He knew what it was before he even touched it. The moment his fingers brushed the edges of the paper, the room seemed to shift. The weight of the letter in his hand was heavier than anything he had ever held before. He unfolded it slowly, the paper crinkling softly in the silence. As he began to read, the words bled into his mind like ink on paper, raw and unflinching. In the letter, she confessed her love for him. It was not a confession of passion, not the kind he had once imagined in his younger days, but something deeper, something more heartbreaking. She wrote of the life she had once been promised, a life of comfort, of dignity, one where she could rise above her station. But that promise had been stolen from her, taken by men like him, men who built their wealth on the backs of others. She spoke of how she had dreamed of a future where she could escape the endless struggle, a future where she was not bound by the invisible chains that kept her in service. But that dream had died, slowly and painfully, as the years wore on and she realized the truth, that no matter how hard she worked, No matter how much she gave, she would never be free. The confession stung, a sharp reminder of the world he had built, a world where the dreams of others were crushed beneath the weight of his privilege. The words she had written were not just a confession of love, but a statement of everything he had failed to see. He had built his empire on the backs of those like her, and in the process he had forgotten what it meant to be human. As he read the last line of the letter, something shifted within him. The power he had always relied on, the power of his wealth, of his land, was meaningless in the face of this truth. He was no longer a man who could control the world around him. He was a man who had been stripped of his arrogance, of his certainty. He was a man who had come to realize the deep moral decay that had taken root in his soul. The letter slipped from his fingers, and in that moment he understood what he had to do. He had spent his life building an empire, but it had been built on a foundation of lies, of suffering, and of silent injustice. The truth had come to him too late, but it had come. And in that truth, he was forced to confront the cost of the life he had chosen. As he turned away from the bed, the weight of the letter, the weight of her words, followed him. The room seemed darker now, heavier with the burden of what he had just learned. He had come to her thinking he was offering comfort, but in the end, it was he who had been changed. He had been forced to confront the very thing he had spent his life running from, his own guilt, his own complicity in the system that had kept them both trapped. He left the room quietly, the echo of his footsteps the only sound in the stillness. But even as he walked away, the truth hung in the air like a shadow, waiting for him to face it. And in the silence that followed, the weight of the revelation pressed down on him, a burden he could never shake. Some truths are never easy to bear, and some lives are forever altered by the weight of what we choose to ignore. Decades had passed since that cold winter, and yet the town still carried the weight of their story, like a forgotten memory whispered in the darkest corners. The place had moved on, as places do. The buildings had aged, the faces had changed, but there remained the quiet murmur of a tale lost to time, the echoes of a love that had burned too briefly. The man, once a powerful rancher, had seen his wealth dwindle over the years. The empire he had built on the backs of others had crumbled, as empires often do. It had been a slow, insidious erosion, a decline not of nature, but of his own choices. His name, once spoken with reverence, now carried with it a bitter taste of regret. His ranch, once a symbol of strength, now stood empty, a crumbling monument to his arrogance. It was a place haunted not by ghosts, but by memories of a time when the world had been his to command, and a woman had loved him. But the nurse, she had vanished long before the house had fallen into disrepair. She too had become nothing more than a memory, a figure in the shadows of his past. Her life had slipped quietly away, unnoticed by the world, unnoticed even by him until it was too late. The letter she had written to him, confessing everything she had never said aloud, had remained buried for years. It had been hidden, forgotten, as if the truth could be buried along with it. The woman who had once been a fleeting warmth in his cold, calculating world had left behind only her words, fragile, tender words that spoke of love, of longing, of betrayal. The years had passed, and he had moved on, or so it seemed. His fortune had dwindled, his power had withered, but still he clung to the remnants of the life he had built. It wasn't until his death, when the mansion was cleared out and the old wooden beams were dismantled, that the truth of their love was unearthed once more. The letter was found, tucked away in a forgotten drawer, yellowed with age, the ink fading but the words still clear. It was as though the truth had been waiting all those years, buried beneath layers of dust and silence for someone to finally listen. The man's children, those who inherited what was left of his wealth, were the ones who found it. They were the ones who discovered the letter, the secret that had been kept hidden for so long. They read the words, but they did not understand. How could they? They had never known the woman, never known the man who had loved her, never known the weight of the choices he had made. They read the letter with the same detached curiosity that people read old documents in archives, as if the past was something to be studied, not something that could still haunt the present. But as they read, a strange thing happened. The walls of the mansion seemed to groan under the weight of that truth, as though the house itself was stirring, awakening to the memories it had long buried. The truth was simple, yet it had the power to unravel everything that had come before it. She had loved him, the nurse. She had loved him with all her heart, even as she had known that he was not the man he pretended to be. And he, the rancher, had loved her in his own way, but it was a love tainted by his privilege, by his sense of superiority. In the end, neither of them had truly been free. She had lived a life of quiet struggle, and he had lived a life of quiet guilt. Their love had been bound by the chains of a system that they had both been unwilling to challenge. It was a love that had changed them both, but not in the way they had hoped. It had revealed the flaws of a world built on power and silence, a world where the innocent were punished and the guilty remained unscathed. The house still stood, but it felt emptier now. The rooms that had once been filled with laughter and life were now hollow, the echoes of the past resonating in the walls like a distant song that could no longer be heard. The rancher's legacy, what little was left of it, had been reduced to dust and memories. The woman's love had never been returned in full measure, and in the end, she had left no trace of herself behind except for the letter, the fragile confession that spoke of a life she had never lived, of a love that could never be fully realized. And yet the truth had a way of making its presence known, even when it was buried. The letter, though it had been hidden for so long, had resurfaced, and with it came the revelation of all that had been lost. The world may have forgotten them, but their story lived on, carried by the fragile pages of a letter, by the whispers of those who remembered. It was a story of guilt, of love, of unspoken justice, a story that had been silenced but never truly erased. The rancher's name, once spoken with reverence, would now be remembered for all the wrong reasons. And the nurse, though long gone, would be remembered as the one who had loved him, the one who had seen through the mask of his wealth and power. In the years that followed, the house was sold, the land divided, and the ranch that had once been the centerpiece of the man's life was abandoned. The new owners knew nothing of the story, nothing of the love that had once existed between the rancher and the nurse. They knew only that they had acquired a property, an investment, a piece of land that could be cultivated and turned into something profitable. The house, now stripped of its former glory, became just another building, one more in a line of abandoned homes, left to decay with the passage of time. But for those who remembered, the silence in the house spoke volumes. It was a silence filled with guilt, with the weight of a story left untold, with the echo of a love that had changed history but had never been fully realized. The rancher's legacy had been tainted, not by the loss of his wealth, but by the realization that, in the end, he had never truly understood the cost of his choices. He had built an empire, but in doing so, he had lost everything that truly mattered. The nurse, too, had left behind a legacy, though it was one of sorrow and unfulfilled dreams. She had carried the burden of love and loss, of hope and despair until the end of her days. Her love for the rancher had never been returned in full measure, and yet, in the end, it had revealed the deep flaws of the world they had lived in. It had exposed the silence that had allowed so many injustices to go unchallenged, the power that had kept them both bound to their separate worlds. In the quiet of the mansion, long after it had been sold and forgotten, the truth remained. It was there in the walls, in the silence, in the dust. It was there in the letter, in the love that had been too late, in the realization that some names only find peace once the truth is spoken. And for the rancher, for the nurse, and for the house that had once held their secrets, the silence would always be heavier now, a reminder that history is never as simple as it seems.